The last sound Robert truly heard was the ding of his phone, not his own heartbeat. You could almost hear the static charge of 1,000 vibrating phones and blinking cursors. This is where the story begins, with a sound you probably know well, a sound that has become the background score to modern life, the chime. Robert, a 35-year-old architect whose design spanned 3 continents and whose schedule spanned 0 boundaries, was standing by his custom-designed standing desk, reviewing blueprints for a sustainable skyscraper in Singapore. His face, usually sharp with focus, was currently a landscape of micro-twitches and exhaustion. Robert wasn't just working. He was the eye of a digital storm, the conductor of a symphony of alerts. His phone, which was never more than an arm's reach away, vibrated. It was a triple notification, the holy trinity of digital urgency. An email from the Singapore team marked urgent, a Slack message from his co-founder about a client crisis in London, and a WhatsApp notification from a friend asking if he saw the viral video. The chime, a custom, sharp, almost aggressive little ding, sliced through the last thread of his concentration. Now here's the thing that gets your attention. In that single instant, Robert didn't just feel stress, he felt a physical rupture. It wasn't a heart attack, but it was close enough for him. His vision tunneled. The crisp lines of the skyscraper blueprint blurred into an impossible kaleidoscope of blue and grey. He felt his knees buckle, and the carefully curated, perfectly organized world of Robert dissolved into a soundless, paralyzing scream. He didn't faint, not entirely, but he seized up, dropping his expensive titanium pen. The pen clattered, a tiny, insignificant noise that sounded like a gunshot in the sudden, echoing silence of his mind. He was, for a terrifying 30 seconds, completely immobilized, pinned beneath the weight of 7 gigabytes of incoming information. This was the moment the endless feedback loop snapped. Robert's dependency wasn't just professional, it was total. His phone was the first thing he touched in the morning, often before his eyes were even fully open. He didn't wait for the alarm. He woke up already agitated, reaching for the cool glass to consume the night's backlog of digital anxiety. That initial morning scroll, meant to bring him up to speed, was actually a massive, unnecessary shot of cortisol, flooding his system before his feet even hit the floor. Breakfast was a performance of shallow connection, one hand holding a lukewarm coffee, the other perpetually scrolling through feeds of people he barely knew, living lives he barely cared about, all while the real-world view of his stunning city apartment went unseen. He couldn't eat a meal, sit on a subway, or wait in line without the immediate, desperate need to fill the empty moment with digital input. Silence had become a vacuum, and his phone was the only tool he had to plug the terrifying emptiness. He constantly felt the phantom vibration, that subtle twitch in his pocket that wasn't real, but was a neurological expectation, a sign that his brain had been rewired to anticipate the next dopamine hit. He suffered from chronic tech neck, a dull, perpetual ache in his shoulders and spine from perpetually looking down, but the physical pain was easier to ignore than the psychological discomfort of being unplugged. His sleep was a disaster. Even when the phone was nominally charging across the room, the glowing indicator light was a beacon of potential interruption, keeping his nervous system on high alert. He would wake up 3 or 4 times a night, checking the time, then inevitably checking the notifications, thus fracturing his rest into anxious digital segments. He hadn't read a book, truly focused on a long task, or engaged in a sustained, non-work conversation in months. He operated under the illusion of hyperproductivity, the grand lie of multitasking, when in reality his attention was fractured into thousands of minuscule, useless pieces. He was never truly present in any single task, forever toggling between the urgent and the irrelevant, leaving him feeling perpetually behind, perpetually inadequate, and desperately lonely, despite being connected to billions of people. This chronic anxiety had degraded his core skills. His ability to remember phone numbers vanished, his capacity for deep reading withered, and his patience dissolved into an irritable, hair-trigger temper. He had become a victim of his own tools, a brilliant architect whose inner structure was collapsing under the weight of constant, low-level emergency. The doctor called it an acute stress episode, a high-voltage burnout triggered by chronic overstimulation, and a relentless dopamine-driven dependence on his devices. The diagnosis was simple, brutal, and non-negotiable: digital detox. A complete cold turkey disconnection for at least 10 days. Robert, the man who built his empire on instant connectivity, was being ordered into the silent wilderness. Robert had always loved technology. That's the part we often forget in the critique. His firm, Synergy, wouldn't exist without it. They used real-time satellite imaging to track solar gain, AI to optimize material lists, and video conferencing to manage construction across time zones. He had met his co-founder Ben in a global online forum dedicated to bioclimatic design. Technology was a bridge, a tool for impossible feats. It connected his heart to the world's most brilliant minds. It allowed him to send a 50-megabyte rendering to a colleague in Tokyo in the time it took to blink. It was liberation until it became a leash. It wasn't the email itself or the Slack message. It was the expectation of instant response, the internalized panic that every notification was an existential threat. He hadn't just used his phone. He had merged with it, turning his nervous system into a vibrating feedback loop. His mental collapse was the physical manifestation of that overloaded circuit. He chose a retreat in the Appalachian Mountains, a small family-run place called The Stillness. The directions explicitly forbade GPS navigation, forcing him to rely on an actual printed map, which felt like handling an ancient, fragile relic. When he arrived, the first thing they took was his phone. Not just turned it off, but ceremoniously locked it away in a small wooden box with his name carved on the lid, signing a pledge not to ask for it back for 10 whole days. The withdrawal was immediate and savage. His phantom limb was his hand, constantly twitching toward the empty pocket. He felt naked, exposed, and intensely lonely, even though there were other guests. The first 3 days were pure agony: restless sleep, cold sweats, a constant nausea, and a persistent, gnawing anxiety that the entire world was burning down without his knowledge. He felt the acute physical symptoms of dependency: irritability, headaches that seemed rooted behind his eyes from years of screen glare, and an irrational urge to argue with anyone who spoke too slowly. He kept expecting the chime, the vibration, the glowing screen to reassure him of his importance, but all he got was silence, the rustle of leaves, and the distant, unimpressed call of a woodpecker. He spent hours just pacing, trying to metabolize the sheer absence of digital noise, feeling the profound, terrifying stillness for the first time in years. That's when he met Lyra. She was not a therapist, but the retreat's lead guide and resident naturalist. Lyra embodied the opposite of Robert's frenetic energy. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, her hands smelling faintly of wood smoke and pine. She was there to teach them how to be, how to light a fire without a lighter, how to identify edible plants, and how to sit still for an hour without checking a clock. Lyra's eyes, the color of moss after rain, held a depth that made Robert realize he hadn't held someone's gaze for more than 10 seconds in years. He was always multitasking, scanning the room for Wi-Fi signals or waiting for the next ding. She wore a simple charcoal gray sweater and lived in a small, kerosene-lit cabin on the edge of the property. One evening, 4 days into his exile, Robert found himself sitting alone by the creek, scratching desperately at a mosquito bite. Lyra approached, carrying a small tin of homemade balm. She didn't speak immediately, just sat beside him, the silence between them being oddly comforting, not pressurized. "You're twitching," she finally said, her voice low and melodic like the water over stones. "I know," Robert sighed, rubbing his thigh where his phone usually rested. "I feel like I've lost a limb. I keep thinking of all the emails piling up, the decisions being made without me. It's a fear of irrelevance, I suppose." Lyra turned to him and her hands, strong and warm, took his. "Your relevance isn't measured by your inbox, Robert. It's measured by your presence. And right now all your presence is being spent on anticipation, on the next thing, not this thing." She began to gently rub the balm into his skin, her touch surprisingly firm and deliberate. She smoothed it over the bite, then lingered, her thumb tracing the line of his forearm. The skin contact was so unexpected, so real, so unmediated by glass or light, that it sent a jolt through him, a feeling far more powerful and grounding than any vibration alert. The scent of the balm, beeswax, lavender, and a sharp hit of mint, was the first truly vivid sensory input he'd registered since arriving. The connection deepened over the next few days, built not on shared links or witty DMs, but on shared sunsets, difficult climbs, and the simple act of preparing a meal together without Googling the recipe. He saw the positive role of technology. It brought them together in the first place, an abstract connection, but the real, life-altering magic was happening in its absence. Lyra showed him how to exist in the moment, how to replace the anxiety of anticipation with the warmth of genuine connection. One rainy afternoon, they were trapped in her small cabin after a long hike. The kerosene lamp cast long dancing shadows on the wooden walls. They were talking about the sensation of touch, and Robert confessed he realized he had forgotten what skin felt like without the barrier of clothes or the distraction of a glowing screen nearby. Lyra simply smiled, a slow, knowing, utterly disarming smile. The air in the cabin grew thick, not with data, but with a palpable, slow-burning tension. She stood, approaching him slowly, her eyes never leaving his. He could see the pulse beating in her neck, hear the soft rasp of her breath. Everything was real, immediate, and utterly present. Her fingers, the same ones that knew how to read the bark of a tree and distinguish a safe mushroom from a poisonous one, began to lightly explore the texture of his shirt, tracing the muscle beneath. This was the moment, a collision of two worlds, the digital man stripped of his armor, and the analog woman offering him a different kind of frequency, one based on heat and breath. Her touch was slow, intentional, a physical conversation that needed no words, no predictive text, no constant updates. As she moved closer, the scent of pine and rain on her skin was intoxicating. She leaned in, her lips finding the sensitive hollow beneath his ear, whispering a phrase that wasn't about work or the future but about now. "Be here, Robert," she breathed, her voice a low vibration against his skin, far more compelling than any notification ever was. When their mouths finally met, it wasn't a rush of adrenaline, but a deep, slow sink into pure sensation. Every nerve ending, starved by the flat light of his screen, seemed to wake up, screaming with the joy of real immediate contact. He felt the warmth of her body against his, the texture of her clothes, the dampness of her hair, all the rich, complex data points that his brain had been filtering out for years in favor of a pixelated world. It was a reclaiming of the physical self, an erotic awakening fueled by stillness and singular focus. The rest of the world, the emails, the deadlines, the social media feeds, simply ceased to exist. They were two, breathing, sentient beings, finally and completely present for each other, confirming the truth that the deepest connections are always analog, always in the moment. On the 10th day, Robert was a different man. He was relaxed, grounded, and his eyes had regained their light, but with a new calmness. He was genuinely curious about the physical world again. He took long, unhurried breaths. He and Lyra stood together as the retreat owner handed him back his wooden box. The moment he held the phone, it felt alien, heavy, cold, and entirely too sleek. He opened the box, flipped the power switch, and the phone exploded with the digital screams of 10 days' worth of missed calls, texts, and emails. The flood was enormous, but instead of the paralyzing panic he'd felt before, he felt calm. He scrolled through the hundreds of notifications. The client crisis had been averted by Ben. The Singapore team had made a good decision without his immediate approval. The world, it turned out, hadn't ended. He laughed, a deep, genuine sound that surprised even himself. The fear of irrelevance was replaced by the realization that true significance lay not in being needed for every decision, but in being present for the life he was building. He looked at Lyra, whose face was a study in serene patience. He slipped the phone into his backpack, not his pocket. "It's a tool," he said, stating a truth he had forgotten for years. "Not an oxygen tank." Lyra and Robert started a new life together, built on this foundation of intentional presence. He returned to Synergy, but with new rules. No notifications after 6 p.m., 2 scheduled deep work blocks a day with the phone entirely off, and no phones in the bedroom ever. He was happier, more efficient, and a better leader because he was rested and not perpetually fragmented. Crucially, their new philosophy extended far beyond their own use, focusing intensely on the vulnerability of the young. They understood that the catastrophic mental overload Robert suffered as an adult was merely the endpoint of a societal trend that begins in childhood. The evidence is now clear and devastating. Early and excessive screen exposure fundamentally harms children's brains, impeding language development, crushing creativity, shortening attention spans, and promoting anxiety disorders. We must be explicit. The single most protective action a parent can take is to prolong the age of introduction to personal devices for as long as humanly possible. When screens are finally introduced, they must be treated like medicine, strictly limited to a small monitored daily time allowance. Furthermore, every single piece of content a child consumes must be actively, thoroughly, and relentlessly monitored. This is not helicopter parenting. This is defending the delicate architecture of a developing mind against the hyper-stimulating, attention-devouring machine of the internet. Their commitment was clear. The next generation deserves a nervous system capable of peace, not one perpetually primed for alert. To this end, Lyra and Robert established a non-negotiable ritual, a full 7-day screen detox every quarter, a complete scheduled digital blackout, whether they went back to the stillness or simply locked the devices away at home. They realized that detox wasn't a punishment. It was preventative medicine, a necessary system reboot to clean the mental cache and keep the circuit board from burning out. The technology was still a wonderful tool. It allowed them to plan trips, coordinate with his firm, and even share photos of their latest mountain hike, but it no longer dictated their internal rhythm. They used it to enhance life, not replace it. Their happy ending wasn't just finding each other, but finding the balance, connecting through the screens when necessary, but always prioritizing the connection that required nothing more than breath, touch, and being absolutely, intentionally present. If you love this story and want to hear more like it, please hit that subscribe